It is my honor to welcome Dr. Clay Hayes and David Hinchman and Rita German and Vijay Rao. And maybe what we can start off is having you each introduce yourselves, tell us a little bit about where you are and what your role is there. So maybe Dr. Hayes, we can start off with you.
Yes, thank you so much for having me. I'm Clay Hayes. I'm an interventional cardiologist in Jackson, Mississippi. I've been in private practice the whole time here in Jackson. My father started the practice 50 years ago, and we're now up to 21 cardiologists. I did, a lot of my training in different places. I got my first taste of research working for a guy named Marty Leon at the NIH when I was in medical school. And then I went to the Mayo Clinic in Rochester, Minnesota. And then so cold there, we decided to move back home and went to University of Mississippi here and got a little taste of research with the Jackson Heart Study, which is an observation study looking at African Americans and also the ERG trial. And then went into private practice and really started, doing a lot of general cardiology, not just interventional, and learned a lot about what the needs of the community are. And, it's nice to be able to offer, new therapies to patients here in Mississippi because we've got a lot of need. And so that's how I got into community-based research.
Great. Thank you, Dr. Hayes. Dr. Rao?
Yeah, hi. Thank you all for the invitation to join this tremendous group. And my name is Vijay Rao. I'm a clinical non-invasive cardiologist, heart failure specialist, and proudly a cardio oncologist. And Evelyn, I just finished my fellowship about 12 years ago at UCSF. So, shout out to you there. So I originally did an MD PhD program at the Medical University of South Carolina in Charleston. Was very basic science oriented. And then as I progressed through training at Duke for my residency and then UCSF, got more involved with clinical research, looked at a lot of academic positions, and then ultimately started a family and moved back to Indiana, which is where I grew up. And one of the concerns I had originally was, had a deep interest in research, and was I going to be able to pull that off in a private practice? And thankfully, I've had just a tremendous opportunity, and happy to share a lot of the experience over the years doing that. So thanks for the invitation.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for joining, Dr. Rao. Dr. German?
Oh, did you say Hinchman? Yeah.
Oh,
or
yeah.
or differently.
I had said Dr. German, but Dr.
Yeah, if you want to go first, that's fine.
No, I didn't know there was someone. You go.
Hi, my name is Rita Germain. I'm a heart failure specialist. I currently work at St. Francis Heart and Hospital Center, which is in Roslyn, New York, which is in Long Island. And I got interested in research first because when I was in medical school, I was very interested in prevention research and nutrition and obesity. And then as time went on, I trained at Baylor for internal medicine and then came back to New York to do my general cardiology and heart failure training at Stony Brook and then at Montefiore Medical Center. And after I left Montefiore, I really became interested in remote monitoring, which is something that I'm well published in the community, specifically in cardiomems. And I originally had taken a job in an academic center and then was offered a position to run the mechanical circulatory part program at St. Francis Hospital, which I've been at now for 6.5 years. And we are a very interesting hospital because as much as it's not academic, we have a number of clinical trials, both investigator initiated and industry sponsored. And we really strive ourselves on our clinical research opportunities. So we've been very heavy enrollers in both the CardioMEMS post-approval study, the GUIDE trial, and a number of different industry and investigator-initiated trials now. I've actually continued my interest in preventive cardiology as well, and I'm running a program on plant-based vegan diet. So I'm a big fan of Cardionerds. I listen to it all the time, and I was really excited that you guys gave me the opportunity to come tonight and speak to you all.
That was great. Thank you so much, Dr. Germain. I really appreciate you joining. And Dr. Hinchman.
Yeah, Dave Hinchman. I am a non-interventional invasive cardiologist in Boise, Idaho, in a large healthcare system called St. Luke's Regional Medical Center. group of about 20 cardiologists, and I'm the medical director of the clinical cardiovascular research program, have been for about 22 years. I also trained at UC San Francisco in internal medicine, took a research course there, got turned on to it there, did cardiology fellowship up at in Seattle at University of Washington, and stayed on as an ACC Merck fellow doing contrast echo uh, perfusion research for a year, and debated heavily about staying in academics at a university or private practice. Decided to do private practice, and at my first setting was handed a pretty robust research program in Santa Rosa, California. It really sort of just threw me into the fire about how to do clinical research in private practice. The practice became pretty chaotic, and in 2 years, kind of fell apart. So I moved to Boise, Idaho, and I've been here for 22 years and took on an existing research program and shared it with another partner for about 5 years who moved to Hawaii, and I took it over, and it's grown to be quite busy. We have 10 to 16 clinical trials going on at a time in EP, heart failure, lipids, devices, um, imaging, and it really is a great diversion to my usual day of seeing patients and doing procedures. I just think it keeps us all thinking state of the art, making sure we're practicing at the highest level, and then also bringing frontier therapies to our patients. So I've really enjoyed it and found it's a critical component to the whole fund of knowledge in cardiology. There are a bunch of brilliant people coming up with protocols at the academic centers, and that is a pretty competitive arena that requires constant attention and I think is a bit stressful. Whereas being a clinical investigator, I feel like I'm not worried about losing my job if I don't score the next grant, but I know that I have tons of patients with conditions that I can enroll in these trials. I think it's important to expose our community to these trials, that they're not just done in certain cities or other places. I think exposing our community to these trials means the results are representative in my community too. So I've really enjoyed it and think it can be a busy part of your clinical practice if you want to outside of academics.
Yeah, that's really terrific. And part of what I heard is that, you are there taking care of the patients and the patients who themselves are in need and maybe candidates for trials. So it sort of seems like a good fit from that perspective. But, for our panel of speakers, we have such a great variety from, cardio-onc to MCS and shock and interventional cardiology and non-interventional invasive. So you come from different sort of clinical training paths and interests. And maybe, and again, I want anyone to chime in and contribute, but maybe we can start off by just talking a bit about how you got involved with Paraglut HF, and we can use that as just to contextualize some of the different opportunities available to get engaged with specific types of research projects where you at or where you are. So I'll just throw that out there.
Well, from my perspective, we're like our henchmen where we're doing a lot of trials here in Jackson. We've got 16 trials going on currently and a lot of different things. And I'd actually done some work with the CHAMP study, and we have a pretty robust research group. We have about 6 research nurses, and just always looking for opportunities to help patients. And heart failure is a big problem in Mississippi, and so that's one of the things when this came by our sort of office, we said this is a good opportunity. So that's how we got involved. And plus, they were looking for patients. African Americans are underrepresented in a lot of the trials. And so obviously in Mississippi, we have the highest percentage of African Americans in the country is per capita. And so, there's a lot of folks that need a lot of help. And so we wanted to sign up and help those folks. And it's been really good. So that's how we got involved.
Yeah, I would say from my perspective that one of the pieces of advice I would give is to know your strengths and know your weaknesses before getting involved with clinical trials. And I think as a heart failure director, we had a unique opportunity because we have a dedicated heart failure inpatient unit. We have a pretty large infrastructure to take care of the folks. And so that allowed us to really, get a lot of patients enrolled in inpatient heart failure trials. We originally started with serelaxin, if you all remember that, the drug that didn't make it, which was the pregnancy hormone. But that gave us a lot of experience with trying to do an inpatient heart failure trial, which is very different than an outpatient study. And so we were kind of prepared. We had all the infrastructure. And, one of the things I would tell folks also is, under promise and over deliver. So when you initially get started, you don't want to say you're going to have 100 patients, then you get 5, because the partners will not be calling you for the next trial. So that's, again, getting back to the concept of knowing your strengths, realize where you're going to be successful, start small, pick 1 or 2 trials. We also do about 20 different clinical trials across the spectrum, but um, so those would be some of the things I would suggest and recommend.
Yeah, I would mimic the same. We were part of Paragon, so naturally Novartis looked at us as a high enrolling center. But I think to Vijay's point, it's really important to look at your infrastructure and make sure that you have the proper infrastructure to be successful in these trials. And look at your patient population. You see the inclusion criteria when a company approaches you. You know what you're seeing on a daily basis and see how much you think that's going to match. It's okay to pause and say, who's going to help me with this trial? Who are my research nurses? Is it realistic that if this trial is inpatient, they're going to be available to see these patients and include these patients after 5 p.m.? Because we don't have residents or fellows to do things like that. And most important, do I have the patient population which fits this inclusion criteria? And every trial I get approached for, I look and I say, okay, is this an inpatient or outpatient? Who am I seeing on a daily basis? Who are my partners seeing? How much of my partners want to get involved in this trial? What's going to be the interest in my community? And how hard is it going to be enrolled, knowing what your population is like? And once you answer those questions, trials naturally are going to get more acceptable on a daily basis. And companies know this. And they look at the historical nature of what you've done before, and that's going to make them approach you for the next trial.
I would agree. In Idaho, we were part of Paragon, Paradise, Paraglide. Once you are involved, and if you do well, you get invited for upcoming trials. The same with Amgen lipid studies, and other routes. And the Timmy group was another very busy sort of pipeline that once you're involved with Timmy or Duke Clinical Research, and Cleveland's system, I think they sort of churn out a lot of clinical trials, and if you've had decent enrollment, you'll get invited to future ones. And I would agree that you tend to look at the inclusion exclusion trial and go, oh my gosh, I have thousands of those patients, and then you find out, in fact, a lot of them have the exclusion criteria. They're not as interested as you might think. Your partners are too busy to remember which trials are open or which aren't. And it ends up kind of falling just to your own practice to find the patients. Because I think that's one thing I struggle with in clinical research, is that my partners are all busy, and it's very hard to keep them up to date about which trials are open. You may present it a week before it's going to open, and then it gets delayed, and they refer a patient and they get it rejected because the study's not open yet. Well, they never call again because that was a waste of their time. So, being able to keep a live menu of what's open for enrollment or not has always been a challenge. So those are some challenges in the field.
Yeah,
I
that's
don't know if it's
true.
been helpful for you guys, but I try to do a once a month meeting with the immediate partners, not even if any of them are interested in clinical research or not, just to keep them abreast of what's active and what's upcoming. So it might get them excited about trials we currently have. It might get them excited about future trials. And then, another good point is how to involve the distant partners in the hospital. So, we're obviously a hospital system, like similar to how everyone else is these days. Very few of us are owned, not by a hospital. And so including the other members of staff that work at the hospital is really important to enrollment. And some of the things you have to do for that are really just engaging people every month. So they're aware of what's active. And sometimes we'll put up posters in the ER or we'll have a staff meeting. And that just helps to reacclimate people to what's active.
Yeah, that's terrific. Makes a lot of sense. Sounds like first a feasibility sort of understanding of if you have the patient population, keeping that awareness in the within the group of people who are seeing the patients, and then having a good track record will bring more trials. That all makes sense. And I think some of the work that the fit trialists were doing with the Paraglide study was some of that education with their friends and colleagues and residents and whatnot. So, Jeffrey, I'll invite you to unmute and go ahead and ask your question.
Yeah. So as a trainee, I'll be looking for jobs in the next 2 years. And I know there are some, non-academic institutions clearly that you guys that are interested in research. And so I just kind of wanted to know because I suspect that the typical applicant for these, not like quote unquote, like more private institutions, private practice, the typical applicant isn't looking for research. And so like, how do you incorporate that into the job search? And then also, I also know that, you need to make sure that it's a win-win situation. So how do you ensure that the institution wants to support you in this endeavor? And this is kind of like, I asked this because, we all train at academic institutions. So we all understand what the K-23 and the R01, what all that entails. But I guess I don't really understand what it entails from the side that you guys are on.
Yeah, those are great questions, Jeffrey. I think I can maybe comment on one aspect of that is having gone through about 10 years ago, this whole process that you're talking about. And it's tricky because, you're coming from an academic background, you're going into a private practice setting. I will say most of the folks in private practice, at least the places I looked, were not really focused on research. Really, the primary focus is clinical practice, taking good care of patients, building programs and things like that. The research is really kind of an aside. And so, you'll just have to kind of search places out. So when you go and check with practices, there's all sorts of different practices, the sort of mid-America hearts of the world, which have huge research infrastructure, the Kaisers. But then, you might get into a smaller community at a community hospital. And, I don't think you come in, it depends on what you're looking for. If if you go to predominantly clinical place and you start talking about a lot of research, you're probably not going to get very far with that place, but it's probably not a good fit for you anyway. Right. So you kind of need to talk to folks where there's research coming out of those private practices, and then connect with those individuals when you get there and see, like what everyone said, you need to have an infrastructure. I mean, certainly you can go to a place and build something. I think, it sounded like talking to David earlier, he's had to do that at multiple places, Dr. Hinchman. But I think, for me, thankfully, the program already had an established research program. So I kind of got involved early and then was a co-PI on 3 or 4 studies. And then quickly people realized this was a passion and that, if you have some talent at something, the next thing you know, it all lands in your plate. And then eventually you have to figure out how to say no because everything starts coming your way. But it's kind of organic, I would say. But when you're looking, you have to really kind of find the places that kind of fit what you're looking for. And that's a little bit tricky.
And actually, as we're answering this question, I'm going to add just a small part to it. Like, do you have, in addition to support, protected time for these responsibilities where you are?
I'll just quickly say I had no protected time. So everything that I've done on research, and it's usually nights and weekends. Um, it's lunch hour where I'll meet with our research coordinators, and you can probably carve that out depending on where you are. That was not a big focus of the practice I was in, but I've been able to sort of get business time to do cardio oncology and clinical programs. And then in that time that I do clinical programs, I will kind of fit the research in there as well. So you can get creative, but I didn't have any dedicated time coming specifically for research.
I think you could. Oh, go ahead.
Oh, go ahead. Go ahead. Yeah.
Go ahead. Go ahead. Okay, I'll just go and I have another question. So my name's Dan. I'm one of the Cardionerds co-founders, and Really excited to be here. This is particularly very interesting for me. I recently joined the practice. It's a University of Maryland affiliate hospital. It's called St. Joe's Medical Center, and it's a community practice, but with it's a tertiary care center. We see a lot of cardiac patients, and I am interested in clinical research. And we have just recently, over the last couple of weeks, put together a group of cohorts, like a surgeon, myself, and an interventionalist, and some non-invasive cardiologists to put together some sort of research group. And I was just wondering, can you expect some resources from a trial sponsor to help get the infrastructure off the ground, or is this something that you have to figure out a way to, pay research nurse, research coordinators from the get-go, and then kind of expect to have some way of supporting that later? And then another question, which is like not really related, is in academic medicine where you have the currency of academics is clear, right? Like publishing, getting involved with trials, enhances your career directly. When you're in a community center, it's not necessarily part of the currency. So is there like how do you utilize what you're doing? And I understand there's an altruistic reason why you're all doing this, but is there a way that you're also to able to enhance your personal careers, not just in a feeling good way that you're contributing to science, but something practically so that it helps you a little bit. It doesn't have to be financial, obviously, but in other ways. So two kind of unrelated questions.
I'm going to tackle the second part of the question, if that's okay. So, one of the ways it really helps your career and advances not only your personal interests, but also patients really appreciate being able to stay in their backyard and being offered state of the art clinical trials. So, similar to like what you do, I am an assistant professor at an academic center too. So I contrast kind of what I do on a daily basis compared to what an academic place does. And it's really nice to be able to offer clinical trials and top of the line service to people without them having to be referred to another center. So that's a really, really good way to one, put your program on the map. Because if you look at a lot of clinical trials, there's a lot of places that you're kind of like, where is that? How are they a top enroller? They're not even affiliated with that academic place. How did they get there? How did they find all these patients? And you don't have to necessarily have big name PIs to do that, but you want to have some direction and you want to have some uniqueness to your program. And that's a really good way to do it, is to be part of these trials, to separate yourself from just another community center.
Yeah, I would just dovetail on what Rita just said. I think you've got to convince the administration that it's valuable, right? So it may not be bringing in dollars like an RVU would be from clinical volume, but what you're bringing is uniqueness to your program. You're helping the community of patients that you're serving, and it really distinguishes you from the other centers that your center is competing with, your practice is competing with, hospital system. So that's how you go. You start off by working with the administration, convincing them why this is important. And typically they, after COVID, there are a lot of hospital systems that are really suffering right now. So it's hard to go to folks at an administrative level when they're in the red and they're cutting 15, 20% across the board. And you're coming and asking for things for FTEs, for research coordinators, where they don't see the return on investment right away. So it's a challenging time. So I definitely appreciate that, Dan. But that's what you got to do. You've got to be persuasive. You've got to show your passion, show how the return on investment for your organization, and then you'll start. And you start slow. You start with a couple of different coordinators. You can do a lot of things with farming stuff out in terms of IRB. So there's a lot of ways to kind of make it work, but you got to start small and get going. That's what I would say.
So ours is a different approach, so I'm completely independent, our practices and we work with a hospital, but we don't work for a hospital. And so some of the challenges that we face are when we try to do a hospital-based study, we have to go through all the hoops in the administration, and that can be challenging. But we started off just a bunch of folks together. A few of us decided we wanted to do research together, and we personally funded the startup. But once we got going, then we learned how to do budgeting and that sort of stuff. And, we look at the contracts with the outside companies, and we created that. And you just got to hustle. I mean, you go to these meetings, you go to the national ACC meetings, and you go to the programs and you learn and you talk and you just say, look, I want to do this. This is what I can offer. And you just got to get out there and hustle. I mean, there's nothing wrong with that. And, people say, it's bad. All the independent practice guys, they're all about the money and all this sort of stuff. And I just want to call BS on that, and say, come to my practice, come to where I am. Let's see what you think about the patients. And, but you can do it. It's just it's not if you can do it, it's do you really want to do it? And that's the challenge. Sometimes you just have to put your money where your mouth is and make it happen. And what's nice about it is I don't have to worry about a hospital, whether they say I can do it or not. We're going to do it anyway. And so, but you do have to watch the bottom line. I mean, you can't be foolish about what you do, but that's what you do.
I would agree. It takes incredible passion and constant, just attention to making it happen. It certainly would be easier to start in a clinical practice that has some research going, but you can start it on your own. You go to clinicaltrials.gov, look at trials that are starting up, go to the drug or device companies, the society meetings, and just and actually the local drug reps who are sponsoring Eliquis or something. They'll say, hey, are there any clinical trials with Eliquis or with your Watchman device? Any clinical trials open right now? And they usually separate strongly with the commercial side and the research side. And they'll say, well, I can't really talk about it, but I'll get you in touch with the research arm of our company. And they'll come to you and say, I heard you're interested in these trials. Here's what we have coming. What, does it fit your practice? So if you ask people, there are sponsors who will introduce you to the pipeline. I do think it's a constant struggle to convince a non-university system that research is worthwhile. It's what we spend a lot of our time doing, is going back to the administration and explaining why it's important to offer research, because it doesn't make a lot of money. It runs, at best even, sometimes in the red. And these days, hospitals are really struggling. So I think you have to convince them that, uh, you know, the patients appreciate it. It's bringing, academic doctors to your community hospital system. It's better for recruiting. And, it certainly makes my job much more interesting. I mean, I could easily drop this. I do have a half day a week. Thursday afternoons is my admin day. I fill it with director of quality, cardiovascular quality, and research, but I have my research meeting 2 afternoons a month where I meet with my coordinators. We go through all the trials and issues we need to resolve, and I get a small stipend to do that. But, I'd be better off just seeing more patients if I wanted to make money. So you kind of pay a small price to participate in clinical research, but as all these people on the call know, it's totally worth it. Um, it's very rewarding, but you have to really want to stick with it. The institutions also see research as predominantly an enormous risk. If you infuse some unknown agent and anaphylaxis happens and somebody goes into shock and dies, they don't want to get sued. So they look at research as a high risk endeavor, and you have to convince them that that you have safety mechanisms in place and that this is going to be worth the risk to the institution, because they see it as risk and slight money loss and not a lot of benefit. So it's something you really have to have passion to push through at a community center.
Great. This has been really eye-opening. Evelyn, do you want to ask your question?
Yeah. Thanks. Yeah, this been super helpful. So, kind of, question from trainee standpoint, as a first year fellow or resident who are interested in a future career as a site PI for trials. What kind of experiences should we seek out during our training, especially during early training? And what skills do you think are useful or important for like site PIs?
So, Evelyn, get familiar with the logistics of what goes into a trial from start to finish. So, like we were saying, the investigator initiated studies are very different than industry sponsored studies. I'll just speak a little bit about industry sponsored first. So industry sponsored, the main steps are you want to make sure that it's going to be something that your institution supports. So the SRC meeting is basically like the preliminary meeting where they look at all the trials and they say, is this going to fit in our institution? Is this something that's going to be successful? And then it will go on to an IRB. And an IRB could be a local process or it could be a more systematic IRB that's more national. Every institution is different. And because it's private practice or hospital based, it may be a very different process in how an academic place would work. So familiarize yourself with that process and to how long it would take from start to finish, and then what the training would be when actually the trial is approved at your institution. So what are the steps that the company has to come in and who has to be trained? And so that's what I think is really important, is understanding what the timeline's going to be and then what the steps are going to be to get that, to recruit that first patient. And then afterwards, what's going to be your follow-up plan? Or do you understand how the follow-up's going to work? And do you have the resources to get the follow-up and where the follow-up's going to happen? So anywhere from the pharmacist to your local IRB people to what's going on at your institution, I think are really important steps to learn to understand how that's going to extrapolate into your private practice. And if it's going to be an investigator initiated, then understanding who would be your statistician, who would be somebody who supports what you're writing and your proposal, and does your proposal make sense? And establishing a mentor, I think, is really important for that too. And that's something that I've always learned with maintaining your relationship with an academic place and where you trained is really, really helpful, because most likely your mentors have been through the same steps, but because they're still working in an academic place, it's a little bit different. But they're still really helpful to recommend which companies to think about working with, how to access grants. You know, I've been able to get research money through things like Abbott, St. Jude on my own without, doing big R01 grant and just things that are smaller for investigator projects. So walking through the steps of how those things happen, I think, is really important to learn.
Yeah, I would add to that, Evelyn, that there's a lot of walls put up between. So specifically talking about industry sponsored studies, for obvious reasons, there's a big movement in academia to sort of keep industry outside of academia in terms of the training for residents and fellows and medical students. And so I was, grew up in an era where that was definitely the case, and it was just I had very little exposure to industry. And what happened as soon as I moved over to private practice, it was, there was much better opportunity to engage. So it wasn't this whole, you can't be in the office, you can't do this. So you start working with the medical science liaisons from the different companies, you start learning about all this exciting thing going on, and you can apply for investigator initiated studies, put mini grants together. It's a lot more fluid, a lot more dynamic, and it's really refreshing in some ways. I mean, I understand why the aspects are there during training to sort of protect trainees from, you can obviously have extremes on either end. But, and for me, what I did was I got involved with a trial at UCSF. Actually, I was part of the ECHO CRT study, which was a narrow QRS looking at chronic resynchronization therapy. So I was, enrolling patients for that when I was a fellow. And interestingly, as soon as I moved over into private practice, the trial was still ongoing. I became the site PI at our private practice because I already knew all about the trial. I'd already enrolled patients. It was easy for me to explain everything to my partners. So it was a very easy transition. So I would try as a resident or fellow to see if you can't, get involved with enrolling patients in some of the studies of your faculty. And that's a great way, as Rita points out, to learn how the whole process works. I think the actual PI part of it is, again, just you'll learn it on the fly when you actually get out and start doing it. So I wouldn't get too worried about not knowing everything. I wouldn't say I knew everything there was to know about clinical trials until and I still don't, but you learn with each given trial that you get involved with. Your experience grows. You understand, how to make things happen, how to be a high enroller, and how to, retain patients. I just wanted to point that out too, that we talk a lot about being a high enroller in studies, but it's really not looked favorably upon if you have 30 patients that you enroll and 15 of them drop out of the study, right? So the sponsors really look at your ability to retain patients to the ends of trials. We don't really talk about that a lot, but it's really important to do that, to follow up with patients, to talk about why it's important to stay in the study when some of these side effects occur and things. So that was just another point I wanted to throw out there.
There are a couple societies that can steer you through the logistics if you want to learn from scratch, like the Association of Clinical Research Professionals, ACRP. They have a sort of certified principal investigator program. You can take a board exam to get certified in it and recertify every 5 years or so. There's also the Collaborative Institutional Training Initiative, or CITI, program that you may have heard of or already done. They have online modules that you have to sort of renew every 2 to 3 years. At our institution, we ended up setting up a whole. I pushed to get a medical director of clinical research in general for our institution because we had different rheumatology and ortho bodies doing research, and it became stressful to the health system. But when somebody was overseeing the entire program and ensuring that everyone was certified and following best practices, and then also looking at budgets similarly and deciding if you're going to do a local or a central IRB strategy, these things end up determining how quickly you can review and get a study up and running, which turns out to be the key to getting invited to doing studies. A lot of initially, we'd be invited to do a study, and it would take almost 9 or 12 months to get it up and rolling, and then you don't get invited again. So a critical question the sponsors will come to you with is, how fast do you turn this around? Do you have, you know, in parallel budget and, you know, human subjects review happening simultaneously, and how quickly can you get up and running? So that takes a strong team. And I think, I also really rely on I have a regulatory coordinator, a research manager, and 4 nurses who are research coordinators. But the regulatory and the research manager are always cross-checking me and saying, Dr. Hinchman, this is a little bit concerning. If this patient, has a history of alcohol use, or they're always looking for reasons that we may not want to enroll a patient that we're not going to be able to hang on to, or something about the budget, or something about just the way the patients are going to be cared for in the trial. It helps to have a strong team that's overlooking issues you may not have thought of. So I depend heavily on a strong team that's had experience, and they're looking at a different perspective than I am.
This is fantastic and also very actionable advice. Victoria, do you want to ask your question?
Yeah. How have you all managed to recruit? I wrote root, but recruit minority patients and women in studies. We've seen some increased numbers with women, but I still feel like the minority numbers are still so significantly low in these groundbreaking trials, whether it be medication or even new devices. And so I'm just, really trying to figure out, like, am I going to have better engagement in the community? What are
Uh,
you all's thoughts, and how have y'all done?
Yeah. So we, as I mentioned before, in Mississippi, there is some. It's helpful to have the Jackson Heart study where we are because they understand that a lot. It's observational. It's like Framingham. I mean, it's a big. So they understand the importance of that to help their community. And so, we try to use that to say, look, research is being done. We want you to get better. You want to get better for you and your family. And right now that there's opportunities for you that we can help you. And it's just building relationships. I mean, that's, kind of the core of everything really, is just setting the foundation and developing good relationships and treating the patients well. And then when you do that, then other people, they talk about the community, and then they can actually help recruit other patients for you. So it's all about just doing a good job, taking good care of people, and it helps a lot. But it's a lot of explanation. The other thing we've done, hey, if you don't understand something, why don't you bring your family member with you, or your church member, or somebody you trust, and let's go over it. So you have to spend a lot of time, but in the end, it's worth it. That's how we do it. So I'd be curious about how other sites do it.
Yeah, I would say we're on the south side of Indianapolis. It is like 99% Caucasian. So it's difficult for us to enroll African Americans or any other racial component. But I would just say, just in general, that it's really important. There is a large distrust from certain populations of research, and for I think very good reason, with our historical basis in this country. So I think there's a lot of effort that needs to be placed on trying to develop trust with communities. And I think that's part of the reason why we're not enrolling nearly enough, underrepresented groups. So even though in my local area we don't have that, I would just really, recommend that we as a community just need to do better in terms of certainly getting more women involved in these studies, and also, folks from underrepresented communities.
I think if that's where you practice and you have minorities in your practice, you will be able to enroll them. It takes, you can have the coordinators screen and serve up candidates for a trial that meet all the criteria, but you need the doctor, that patient's doctor, to walk in the room and endorse the idea of participating in the study. And that's what it's going to take. So if you have that physician-patient relationship, you're going to be the one that can, you know, just encourage them to see the benefits for medicine, the community, and themselves in participating. Even we know that patients that are in the placebo arm of clinical trials do better than those who are not in clinical trials, even if they're just getting placebo, because they're monitored closely. They have close contact with physicians. We're screening. We sometimes pick up stuff we weren't expecting and not looking for that'll help them. So there are benefits to participating. Um, and I just think you as the patient's doctor are best at enrolling them. And you'll always be surprised at who does or does not want to participate. It's almost like guessing somebody's lipoprotein A level. You can look at people and you have no idea. And some people say, you mean you want me to be a guinea pig? No. And the next person will go into tears saying, I would do anything to help somebody with this condition, with an implantable loop recorder, even if it's not going to benefit me, just to know that you may be able to help monitor patients in the future better. So you just never know who's going to drop drop over to participate or walk out the door when you pose it.
Thank you.
All right. So we have maybe 5 to 10 minutes left. And maybe what we can do is to end it off is I've heard that the finances sometimes don't make sense. The employers and partners sometimes don't um, don't immediately see the value. There's a lot of work involved, and you have to hustle, and you may not have protected time. So maybe each of you could just tell us what drives you to participate in clinical research and give access to your patients to these trials. And in Cardionerds speak, what makes your heart flutter about being engaged in clinical research where you are?
I'm always amazed that every time we complete a trial, it just leads to more questions. Even something we feel like we just need to demonstrate, it's never been proven, so you got to do this trial to demonstrate. Well, it turns out, you know, given folate, it lowers homocysteine levels, but doesn't have any clinical benefit. Or dalcitrapib and torcetrapib have 80% rises in HDL levels, but they had no clinical benefit for the patient, increased mortality for torcetrapib. So I think, there's such exciting news at the bench about molecules coming along that do these great things. And then it's not until you put it in practice and see what it does for your patients in these big clinical trials in the real world that you actually see whether you're going to help people or not. So that's a huge component of medical research that you can participate in outside the university.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think intellectual curiosity plays a huge role, and similar to what Dr. Hinchman was saying, it really brings on new clinical questions you ask yourself. And I think you learn something every time you participate in a trial, whether it be from what the clinical question is to some extrapolation of the question to just how the process goes. And it's so exciting even to be part of the meetings that they have as a local PI when they have their PI meetings that routinely will happen. You just get to learn about so many different centers and how they do things and comparing and contrasting how the rest of the country works with recruiting patients. And I just think it really moves along why you do medicine. And your intellectual curiosity can drive and break up some of the mundaneness of just what you do every day. It really brings on a different perspective on why you're practicing what you're doing.
Yeah, I was driven to cardiology like many of you probably because I just love the patient population, but also the fact that there's evidence for what we do in cardiovascular disease instead of this concept of eminence-based medicine. Someone really famous said we should do it this way. So we've just done it this way forever, right? But here we have a large population. We can test hypotheses. And for me, science has always been part of my clinical journey. And so it just made it was a natural extension. I mean, I get really probably more excited about the research than I do almost anything else I do, whether it works or it doesn't work, because we're answering questions and we're providing new opportunities for patients. And so, it's incumbent upon us to be out there in the community where the vast majority of patients are existing to, as Dr. Hinchman said earlier, these trials have to be applicable to the general population, right? So you've got to get the patients from the community in order to really test the hypothesis. And so, it's really a privilege to be able to do that. And it absolutely drives me.
Yeah, it's interesting to see things actually work too. I mean, I remember 30 years ago when I was in medical school, they said, "Oh, don't give beta blockers to heart failure patients; you'll kill them." And then they're like, "What?" And somebody challenged that idea, and then I got to be part of the original, Carvedilol studies, and people started getting better. And I said, "Now wait a minute, now we got to challenge these ideas." And even now, I mean, seeing the Arnie's, that people get better, and you go, "Wow, this is pretty cool." And so that's always been kind of gets me all fired up about is seeing the patients get better and challenging some ideas. It's fun. I really practicing medicine is great. I mean, it really has been fantastic, and I'm excited. Y'all get me all fired up too. All these smiling faces, and everybody's like trying to learn the next big thing. I mean, that's how much more fun can you have? Really, it's fun.
That was perfect to end us on. This has been awesome. Really, thank you guys so much. I personally feel so inspired that you don't have to be at a university to have such an incredible impact for your patients, for your community, and science at large. And I think it's really liberating because, you sort of grow up in your training with one perspective and just kind of see how many different opportunities there are to continue to do the things that really drive you. So it's just fabulous. Thank you so much.